My name is Olivia Rose. And I am 28 years old. I grew up in a simple, traditional family where my mother was a nurse, my father a carpenter, and I was their only child. Things were far from perfect. But to me, it was home, a place filled with memories of warmth and peace. Yet, time seems to have changed everything. Now, that house feels like a hollow shell. A place I barely recognize. One I sometimes wish I could escape from, leaving behind the fading fragments of memories it holds. My mom. She was the heart of everything. The unshakable center of our little world. Her name was Sophia Marie. And she carried a strength that was quiet but unwavering. A beauty that was radiant yet understated. And a kindness that seemed limitless. Every single day. Even now. She occupies my thoughts. A constant presence in the recesses of my memory. Sophia wasn't just a nurse by profession, she was a healer in every sense of the word. She had this innate ability to make everyone around her feel valued. To lift others even when she herself was burdened. No matter how difficult her day had been. She'd come home. Hum softly while cooking. And fill the house with a warmth that seemed to melt away the weight of the world. Her smile, even in the toughest of times, was like sunlight breaking through the darkest clouds. She was my anchor. The one person I could confide in. The one I trusted completely. Last year, everything changed. It felt like the earth shifted beneath us, leaving cracks that could never truly be repaired. My mom was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. And it blindsided us. There were no warning signs. No gradual indicators. She'd always been so strong. The one who took care of everyone else. Who carried the burdens of others without complaint. I remember the day she told me. Her voice trembled ever so slightly. A crack in the facade of her usual strength. But her face wore a smile. The same smile that had always been there to reassure me. We're going to get through this. Olivia, she said. Her tone soft but resolute. Together. Yet, even as she said it, I could see the unspoken truth in her eyes. She already knew how this battle would end. What followed was a whirlwind, a blur of hospital visits, treatments, and moments that felt stolen from the life we once knew. The doctors were grim, explaining that the cancer had spread too far, that there was little they could do beyond offering her comfort. It all unraveled so quickly. Chemotherapy sessions, endless appointments, and sleepless nights by her bedside became our new reality. The house, once filled with laughter and the hum of her melodies, grew heavy with silence. It was as though her illness had drained not just her vitality but the spirit of our home itself. My dad, Joseph, struggled to cope. He was never one for overt displays of emotion. But this was different. He withdrew, retreating into himself in a way that left me feeling more alone than ever. I tried to be strong, for him. For Mom. For myself, but the weight of it all was suffocating. As her condition worsened, I became her primary caretaker. I don't regret it for a second, it was the least I could do for the woman who had given me everything. But it broke me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. Caring for her was an act of love. But it was also a daily reminder of what we were losing. The final weeks were the hardest. Watching her fade, hearing her voice grow softer with each passing day, was a kind of pain I can't put into words. She'd whisper to me in those quiet moments, telling me how proud she was, how much she loved us. Her words were a comfort and a dagger. each one reminding me of the inevitability I couldn't accept. I spent countless nights sitting in the hallway outside her room. My tears silent but relentless. I wanted her to believe I was strong, that I could handle it. But the truth was, I felt like I was unraveling. When she passed, it was as if the world itself stopped. The house felt hollow, like a shell of what it once was. Time moved forward, but I felt stuck, suspended in the moment of her absence. My dad and I were left to navigate a landscape of grief that neither of us understood. We were two strangers sharing a space that no longer felt like home. He became more withdrawn, and I didn't know how to reach him. We didn't grieve together, we grieved apart, each in our own isolated way. For a while, I clung to the hope that we could find our way back to each other. That maybe, in our shared loss, we could find solace and strength. But as time went on, subtle changes began to emerge. Little things that didn't sit right. Moments that made me question everything. At first, I chalked it up to my own grief, to the heightened sensitivity that comes with loss. But the feelings didn't fade. Instead, they grew, feeding my unease. Before everything fell apart, our family life had its own unique rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. My parents were immigrants, each bringing with them a rich tapestry of history and tradition. My mom, Sophia, hailed from Ireland, with her lilting accent and love for old Irish folk songs. My dad, Joseph, was from a small town in Scotland. Quiet but steady. The kind of man whose actions spoke louder than words. They met while working in a factory shortly after arriving in this country. Two people searching for something better and finding it in each other. Our home, though modest, was a sanctuary. My mom had a gift for turning the simplest moments into something extraordinary. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was an event. It was where we shared stories, laughed until our sides hurt, and occasionally argued over the smallest things. Her traditions, the Irish songs she'd sing while cooking, the holidays she made magical, were woven into the fabric of our lives. My dad, though quieter, had his own way of showing love. He worked long hours as a carpenter, always coming home exhausted but never too tired to fix a broken bike or bring home my favorite snack. Those small gestures spoke volumes. But after Mom was gone, that rhythm was shattered. The house that had once been alive with her presence felt empty. And the man who had once been my silent protector became a stranger. I thought I could hold on to the memories, that they would be enough to keep her spirit alive. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the distance between my dad and me grew wider. And in that growing chasm, I began to see shadows I hadn't noticed before. Shadows that made me question everything I thought I knew about the man who had raised me. Life without her was uncharted territory. The grief, the silence, the uncertainty, it was a storm I wasn't prepared for. And in the midst of it, I found myself not just mourning the loss of my mom but grappling with the unraveling of the life I thought I knew. I was an only child, and that meant my world often revolved around my parents. With no siblings to share the spotlight, their presence shaped my life in profound ways. My mom was everything to me, a force of nature wrapped in warmth and love. She was my confidant, my cheerleader, my partner in crime. She'd sit with me for hours, helping with school projects that ranged from solar systems to dioramas. Her patience endless. On quiet nights, we'd huddle in the kitchen, whispering about boys and dreams under the soft glow of a single lamp. At my soccer games, her voice would rise above the crowd. A mix of pride and encouragement that made me feel invincible. Dad, on the other hand, was a quieter presence in my life. He was supportive in his own way. The kind of person who believed actions spoke louder than words. He attended my games and clapped politely from the sidelines. But he wasn't the type to shout my name or rush to hug me after a win. Conversations with him felt like walking on a narrow bridge, careful and measured. He was dependable. Yes. But not someone I felt I could pour my heart out to. That emotional gap between us, though unspoken, grew over the years. Like a shadow in the background. Being part of an immigrant family added its own layer of complexity. There were nights when we counted every penny, meticulously planning how to stretch what little we had. My parents worked tirelessly, often putting their own needs on hold to ensure I had what I needed. They never complained. But I could see the weight of their sacrifices in the tired lines on their faces and the quiet sighs they thought I didn't hear. Despite the struggles, my mom always found a way to shield me from despair. She had this unwavering optimism, a belief that tomorrow would be better. Hard times don't last forever. Olivia, you'll see, she would say. Her voice filled with a conviction that made me believe it, too. But life has a way of testing even the strongest among us. When Mom got sick, it felt like the ground beneath my feet shifted. She had always been the strongest person I knew. A woman who could juggle 100 things and still have the energy to make me laugh. Watching her battle cancer was like witnessing a storm slowly erode a mighty tree. Day by day, piece by piece, it took her strength, her hope, and eventually, her light. The house, once filled with her laughter and life, became quieter, heavier. Her absence left a void so vast it felt insurmountable. She had been the glue that held our family together, the bridge between me and my dad. Without her, it was as if we were two strangers forced to cohabit a space that now felt foreign. We stumbled through our grief separately, unsure how to reach each other. The silence between us grew, not just in volume but in weight, until it became suffocating. At first, I thought the awkwardness between my dad and me was just part of mourning. We were both navigating uncharted waters, trying to adjust to life without her. The house felt too big, the emptiness too loud. Conversations became rare. And when they happened, they felt stilted, like neither of us knew the right words to say. I told myself it would get better, that we'd find our way back to some version of normalcy. But instead, things took an unsettling turn. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, little comments that felt out of place. At first, I brushed them off, convincing myself it was just his way of trying to fill the silence. "She's got legs for days, doesn't she?" he remarked one evening while watching TV. His tone casual, as if he were commenting on the weather. I laughed awkwardly, unsure of how to respond, and quickly changed the subject. But the comments didn't stop. They became more frequent, more pointed. Women these days don't leave much to the imagination. "Huh," he said another time, his eyes lingering on the screen. Each comment left me feeling unsettled, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. I tried to dismiss them, to rationalize his behavior. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe he didn't realize how his words came across. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The man I thought I knew, reserved, distant but respectful, was starting to seem like a stranger. And I didn't know how to navigate this new reality. Thank you for being here, it means so much to have you along on this journey. If you're ready for more stories, insights, and moments of growth as I navigate life's twists and turns, stay with me. Together, we'll make this adventure even more meaningful. One evening, we were sitting in the living room. The soft glow of the TV casting shadows across the walls. We'd decided on a romantic comedy. Something light-hearted to fill the silence that often stretched between us these days. The movie unfolded with its usual mix of charm and humor, leading to a scene where the protagonist shared an intimate, tender moment with his love interest. It was sweet. The kind of scene that made you smile without thinking. Out of nowhere, Joseph broke the spell. You think that's what women really want? A guy like that? His voice cut through the air, sharper than it needed to be. I froze. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, probing, almost challenging. Like he wasn't really talking about the movie at all. My instinct was to deflect, to keep things casual. I don't know, Dad, I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. It's just a movie. He nodded, but his expression lingered in my mind long after the scene had passed. There was something unsettling in his eyes. Like he wanted to say more but was holding back. For that, I was grateful. At least for the moment. The next day, the subject came up again. This time, it was during dinner. We sat across from each other. The clinking of silverware the only sound in the room until he decided to break the silence. You're a woman, Olivia. Don't you ever think about stuff like that? What makes a man, you know, attractive? I nearly dropped my fork. The question blindsided me, leaving me flustered and embarrassed. My face burned as I fumbled for a response. I really don't think this is a conversation we need to have, I said, trying to sound firm but feeling anything but. He chuckled. A low, dismissive sound that made my skin crawl. Come on. We're adults. We can talk about these things. Dad. Please. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's too much. For a moment, he looked genuinely annoyed. His brows knitting together as if my discomfort were an inconvenience to him. He didn't push further that night. But the air between us felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that lingered long after the dishes were cleared away. As the days turned into weeks, his comments became more frequent, more brazen. They weren't confined to fleeting moments during movies or casual dinners. He'd drop remarks about women's bodies, about relationships, even about his own frustrations. Each word felt like a stone added to the weight I carried around. A burden that grew heavier with every passing day. I began avoiding him. I stayed late at work, finding excuses to keep myself occupied. At home, I retreated to my room as soon as I walked through the door. The walls of my sanctuary becoming my only solace. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, I couldn't escape the unease that seemed to shadow me everywhere I went. Then came the day he mentioned his prostate issues. It was so casual, so matter-of-fact. We were sitting in the kitchen, and he started talking about how he'd been having trouble urinating. At first, I thought it was just a health concern he wanted to share, something mundane and benign. But then he said it. The words that made my stomach churn. You know, these things happen to men when they want to have sex but can't. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My hands clenched around the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white as I stared down at my plate. I wanted to scream, to tell him to stop. But the words caught in my throat, choked by a mix of shock and fear. "It's natural, Olivia," he continued, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Everyone goes through it at some point." I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing closer with every second. This wasn't natural. Nothing about this conversation was natural. And yet, I sat there, frozen, unable to do anything but endure it. That night, I lay in bed, the events replaying in my mind like a broken record. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, a disturbing one. And it was only getting worse. Looking back, I wish I'd spoken up sooner. I wish I'd trusted my instincts instead of second-guessing them. But at the time, I was paralyzed by a toxic mix of fear and confusion. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into things. But the truth was staring me in the face, and I was too scared to confront it. The day it all came to a head started like any other. I'd just gotten home from work, my mind occupied with mundane thoughts about deadlines and dinner plans. I wasn't prepared for what was waiting for me, the moment that would shake the fragile balance I'd been clinging to. Maybe I should have seen it coming. Maybe there were signs I missed, red flags I ignored because it was easier than facing the reality. But when it happened, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me floundering in a sea of doubt and despair. And in that moment, I realized there was no escaping it anymore. The time for avoidance was over. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As soon as I walked into the house, something felt undeniably off. It was a subtle shift, but it prickled at the edges of my awareness like an almost forgotten memory. My dad, Joseph, stood in the kitchen. And for a moment, I didn't recognize him. Gone were the loose, worn-out pajamas or the baggy t-shirts he wore every day as he shuffled through life since Mom passed. Instead, he was impeccably dressed, a crisp, button-down shirt tucked neatly into a pair of dark slacks. His hair, usually unruly and unkempt, was combed back, giving him an air of unusual effort. He was cooking dinner, his movements measured and precise as the faint smell of garlic and herbs filled the room. When he turned and saw me, he smiled, a smile that wasn't quite right. It wasn't the easy, tired grin I'd grown up seeing. It was too deliberate, almost calculated, as if he were trying to project something specific. "Hey, sweetheart," he greeted me, his tone warm but with an undercurrent of something unplaceable. "How was work?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden brightness in his demeanor. "It was fine," I replied, my words clipped, already feeling an inexplicable sense of unease crawling up my spine. I couldn't pinpoint it, but there was something about his posture, his tone, even the way his eyes lingered on me a fraction too long, that felt off. My instincts whispered warnings I didn't quite understand yet. I dropped my bag near the door and walked into the kitchen, forcing a casualness I didn't feel. Like clockwork, I went to help with the salad, a silent ritual we'd developed in the absence of Mom. As I reached for the lettuce, Dad began chatting, more animated than I'd seen him in months. He asked about my day, the weather, even if I'd caught any good movies recently. His questions felt rehearsed, almost too eager. But I responded out of habit, trying to shake off the strange tension that hung between us. And then he said something that stopped me cold. "You know," he started, his voice softening into something uncomfortably intimate. "We've been through a lot this past year. Losing your mom, it's been hard on both of us." My hands paused mid-chop. The knife in my grip hovered over the cutting board, and I kept my eyes fixed on the lettuce, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. "Yeah," I murmured, my voice barely audible. The weight of his words pressed against my chest, stirring memories I tried not to dwell on, the quiet sobs late at night, the emptiness in the house that no amount of time seemed to fill. "But we've managed, haven't we?" he continued, his voice calm, almost coaxing. "We're still here. We've stayed strong, haven't we? You and me, two smart, open-minded people." Something in the way he emphasized those words, strong, open-minded, sent a jolt through me. My stomach twisted. The uneasiness I'd felt since walking in now roaring into a full-blown alarm. I set the knife down carefully, my movements deliberate as I turned to face him. "What are you trying to say, Dad?" My voice was low, steady, but it carried an edge I couldn't hide. He hesitated, and in that brief pause, I saw a flicker of doubt cross his face. But then he took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders as if steeling himself for something monumental. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone casual but with a deliberate undercurrent. "About us. About how we've been supporting each other through all of this. We're both adults. And we're both lonely. Until you find someone. Maybe we could be there for each other." For a moment, his words didn't register. Or maybe my mind simply refused to process them. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the air around me growing thicker as I tried to comprehend what he'd just said. "Be there for each other," I repeated, my voice cracking as the implications of his words began to sink in. My hands gripped the counter behind me, desperate for something solid to hold on to. "What does that even mean?" I stared at him, waiting for an answer, my heart pounding against my ribs as the silence stretched between us. The weight of his gaze, the tension in his stance, the surreal absurdity of what he was suggesting, it all collided in a single moment of understanding that I desperately wished I could unsee. He averted his gaze, unable to meet my eyes, as if the weight of his words was too much for him to bear. "You know what I mean, Olivia," he murmured, his voice barely audible yet strikingly clear in the suffocating silence. "We could keep each other company, until you find a boyfriend." The air in the room thickened, and it felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted. My chest tightened, each breath shallow and labored. My mind raced, trying to process the absurdity of what I had just heard. "Are you serious right now?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Have you completely lost your mind?" He took a hesitant step closer, his hands raised in a placating gesture, as though he could somehow smooth over the jagged edges of his words. "Not like that," he stammered, his tone growing increasingly desperate. "Not all the way. I just mean, we could play around. Make each other feel less alone." "Stop," I snapped, recoiling as though his very presence was toxic. "Just stop talking. Do you even hear yourself? Do you understand how utterly vile that sounds?" His face twisted in a grimace, a flicker of pain flashing across his features. But then his expression hardened, as if he was bracing himself. "You don't understand," he muttered defensively, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's just a thought, a fleeting thought. I didn't mean anything by it." "A fleeting thought?" I echoed, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You've thought about this long enough to say it out loud to me. Don't insult me by calling it fleeting." He began pacing the room, his hands running through his hair in an agitated rhythm. "I'm lonely, Olivia," he confessed, his voice cracking as it rose with raw emotion. "Your mom's gone, and I don't know how to handle it. I've got no one. And you're beautiful. You're here. It's not like I'd stop being your dad." A cold wave of nausea surged through me, and I felt the bile rising in my throat. "Do you even hear yourself?" I shouted, my voice raw and unrestrained. "You're supposed to be my protector. My father, not this. How could you even think such a thing? Let alone say it to me?" He froze mid-step and turned to face me, his features crumpling as tears welled up in his eyes. "I didn't mean it like that," he said again, his voice now a whisper, barely audible over the roar of my anger. "It's not me talking, it's the devil. I don't see you like that. You're my daughter. Then why would you say it?" I screamed, my voice breaking under the weight of my emotions. "Why would you even let the thought cross your mind? Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed everything. Everything." His hands fell limply to his sides, and his shoulders sagged under the crushing weight of his guilt. He began mumbling excuses, blaming his loneliness, his grief, and even a movie we had watched months ago where a father had done something similar to his daughter. He claimed it had planted the idea in his head, that it wasn't truly him. But his words only deepened my disgust. Each excuse felt like another slap to the face, a mockery of the trust he had shattered. I unleashed a torrent of anger, my words sharp and unrelenting as I vented every ounce of fear, betrayal, and revulsion that had been clawing at my chest. My voice grew hoarse, my throat raw from screaming. But I couldn't stop. I told him he was sick, that he needed help, real help. For once, he didn't argue. He simply stood there, absorbing the full force of my fury, his face a mask of defeat. Over and over, he whispered, "You're right. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." But his apologies were hollow, devoid of any real meaning or redemption. They hung in the air like empty promises, unable to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. By the time my voice finally gave out, my body felt like a hollow shell. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and tears streamed down my face, though I could barely feel them. He looked utterly broken, his face a pale, ashen shadow of the man I had once called my father. But I didn't care. He had crossed a line so deeply entrenched in the fabric of morality and trust that there was no coming back. No apology could ever erase the stain of his words. No amount of begging could undo the damage he had inflicted. He pleaded with me to forgive him, to move past it, to forget that this moment had ever existed. But I knew better. This wasn't something I could forget, let alone forgive. He had taken something sacred and twisted it beyond recognition. In that moment, I knew that whatever bond we had as father and daughter had been irreparably severed. As I walked away, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence of his guilt, I realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he was no longer the man I thought I knew. And I was no longer the daughter who could trust him. That night, I locked myself in my room. A place that once felt like a haven but now felt more like a cage. I wedged a chair tightly under the doorknob. A futile attempt at security against the person I once trusted most. It was something I hadn't done since I was a child, terrified of imaginary monsters lurking in the shadows. But this time, the monster wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real, tangible, and it wore the face of my father. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have ever anticipated. I sat on the edge of my bed, knees drawn tightly to my chest. My arms wrapped around them like a shield against the world. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but the deafening echoes of his words. We're adults. We're smart. We could just play around. It didn't feel real. It couldn't be real. My mind refused to accept it. Yet it kept replaying like a broken record. Each repetition shattering another piece of the fragile reality I'd known. The walls around me, walls I'd once found comfort in, suddenly seemed oppressive, foreign, hostile. They had witnessed my childhood laughter, my tears, my dreams, and now, my despair. It was as if the air itself had turned against me, thick and suffocating, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out at the universe for turning my life upside down. But I couldn't. My voice was caught in my throat, trapped by the weight of fear and disbelief. Every sound in the house made my pulse quicken. The creak of the floorboards outside my door sent icy chills down my spine. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen felt like a menacing growl in the oppressive silence. Even the rustle of the wind outside felt wrong. As if the world itself was conspiring to remind me of my isolation. I flinched at every noise. My body tense. My mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I didn't trust him anymore. But more than that, I didn't trust anything anymore, not the safety of my home. Not the bonds of family. Not even my own instincts, which had failed to warn me of the danger standing so close. At some point, I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as though the device were a lifeline in a stormy sea. My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating. Who could I call? Who would believe me? My mom was gone, taken by the merciless tide of time. My friends, once a steady presence, had drifted away after her passing, leaving me to navigate grief alone. And my dad, the one person I should have been able to lean on, to trust without question, was the very reason I felt so broken. The thought sent a fresh wave of anguish crashing over me. I scrolled through my contacts aimlessly, the list of names and numbers blurring together in my tear-filled vision. Each one seemed like a door that had long since closed. I was alone in every sense of the word. Adrift in an ocean of pain with no shore in sight. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to feel completely and utterly alone. But then I did something that still leaves me questioning myself. I called him my dad. He was just down the hall. Yet I dialed his number anyway. As though the physical distance was easier to bridge through the phone than face to face. Maybe it was because I needed answers I wasn't sure I could handle hearing. Maybe I hoped the separation would soften the blow of whatever came next. Whatever the reason, I pressed the call button, my heart pounding like a drumbeat in my chest. He answered almost immediately, as if he'd been expecting it. "Olivia," he said, his voice cautious, almost hesitant. There was a fragility to it that I'd never heard before. a trembling edge that made my stomach twist. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The words I'd carefully rehearsed in my head felt clumsy and inadequate now. Finally, I found my voice, though it came out weaker than I'd intended. "Why, Dad?" I said, each word trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Why would you say something like that to me?" There was a silence on the other end of the line that stretched on endlessly, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind, searching for a response. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might hang up. But then he let out a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of regret. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice low and strained. "I wasn't thinking. I've been so lonely, Olivia. And it just came out." His words hit me like a slap. "That's not an excuse," I snapped, my voice rising. I was shaking now, barely able to hold the phone steady. "You don't just say something like that. Not to your daughter. Do you even understand how messed up this is?" "I know," he said quickly, his tone desperate, as though he thought he could somehow pull the words back into his mouth. "I know, Olivia. And I'm sorry. I wasn't myself. It's not who I am. It's the things I've been exposed to. The things I've been watching." Something inside me froze. "What are you talking about?" I asked, dread curling in my stomach like a living thing. There was another pause. Longer this time, as though he was debating whether to tell me the truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Porn," he said. "It's everywhere these days. It's so easy to get caught up in it. I know it's wrong, but it's like it's messing with my head, making me think things I wouldn't normally think." I felt sick to my core. My skin crawled. And for a moment, I thought I might actually vomit. "Are you seriously blaming porn for this?" I asked, my voice sharp and disbelieving. "Do you even hear how absurd that sounds?" "I'm not blaming it," he said defensively. "I'm just saying it's part of the problem. It's not me, Olivia. It's not who I am. I've been struggling. And I don't know how to deal with it." I didn't know how to respond to that. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to end the call, to shut him out entirely. But a small, stubborn part of me, the part that still clung to the memory of the dad who had once been my hero, wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that this was some kind of aberration. That he wasn't the person his actions had revealed. But how could I? How could I reconcile the man I'd grown up loving with the stranger on the other end of the line? "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice breaking under the weight of my emotions. "I can't live like this. Dad. I can't look at you the same way anymore. Olivia. Please," he said. And now his voice was desperate, raw with emotion. "I'll get help. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just don't give up on me." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, and my chest ached with the force of suppressed sobs. Without another word, I ended the call and threw my phone onto the bed. As soon as the connection broke, the dam inside me burst, and I collapsed onto the mattress, burying my face in my hands as hot, relentless tears spilled out. How had it come to this? How had the man who was supposed to protect me, to guide me, become the person I feared most? The questions spun in my mind, unanswered and unanswerable, leaving me feeling trapped. Trapped in this house, in this life, with no clear way out. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And the cruelest irony of all, I still needed him. As much as I hated him in that moment, I still depended on him for shelter, for stability, for the semblance of family I had left. And that realization hurt almost as much as his betrayal. I wish I could tell you that things got better after that I found the strength to walk away and never look back. But the truth is, it only got harder. Each day felt heavier than the last, filled with silences that screamed louder than any argument ever could. 4 days. I barely left my room. Every time I heard his footsteps in the hallway, I froze, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and anger. His words replayed in my mind endlessly, each repetition chipping away at the image of the father I'd once admired. No matter how many times I tried to make sense of it, there was no explanation that could make it okay. I knew I couldn't stay here. Not like this. So I began to plan. It wasn't easy, nothing about this was easy, but I knew I had to find a way out. The first step was reaching out for help. Even though it felt impossibly vulnerable, I contacted a therapist. Someone who could help me untangle the chaos in my mind and guide me toward a way forward. Admitting I couldn't handle this alone felt like admitting defeat. But in reality, it was the strongest thing I've ever done. Next, I started figuring out how to leave. It's not a process that can happen overnight. There are logistics to consider: saving up enough money, finding a safe place to go, and planning how to move my belongings without arousing suspicion. It's overwhelming. And there are days when it feels like too much. But I've learned that progress doesn't have to be big to matter. Even the smallest steps, like looking up apartments online or updating my resume, are steps forward. Through all of this, I've come to understand that it's okay to feel lost. It's okay to be scared, to not have all the answers right away. What matters is that we keep moving, even when the path ahead feels impossible to navigate. That's what I'm trying to do: rebuild my strength, set firm boundaries, and take back control of my life, one step at a time. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest and most exciting videos. Your support is the greatest motivation for us to keep creating valuable content. See you in the next video.